This is the story of Victory Flight 206. On the 8th of April 2013, it was 4 a.m. Zulu time, or 8 a.m. local time, and an F-18 was loaded onto the catapult on the carrier Dwight D Eisenhower, also known as the Ike. Their call sign was Victory 206, and today they'd be providing close air support in Afghanistan as a part of Operation Enduring Freedom. The Eisenhower was in the northern Arabian Sea, and the weather was good. A few clouds between 3,000 and 5,000 feet. Visibility ranged from 4 to 6 nautical miles. It was a bit windy, and thunderstorms were forecast for the boulevard. The boulevard was what the corridor between the northern Arabian Sea and Afghanistan was called. They launched at 0800 local time. As they were leaving Pakistani airspace and entering Afghanistan, they had their first mid-air refueling rendezvous. This is a great time to talk about the fuel system of the F-18 that they were flying. It had 4 internal fuel tanks. Tanks 2 and 3 were the engine feed tanks, and tanks 1, 2, and the wing tanks are transfer tanks. All of this is backed up by tank pressurization tech, and fuel is pumped by some ingenious tech known as motive flow. A motive flow system has no moving parts, and it uses high-pressure fuel to pump more fuel. When high-pressure fuel passes through the nozzle, it produces a suction force that induces a net flow. This is great because it offers high reliability because it has no moving parts. This is used quite a bit on the F-18 to move fuel around from one tank to the other. After a while, they met up with a U.S. Air Force KC-135 tanker, call sign Shell 73 for their next fuel up. This time they were connected for about 8 minutes, and the F-18 took on about 14,800 pounds or 6,700 kilos of fuel on board. But as they were refueling, both the KC-135 and the F-18 hit some clear air turbulence, but they stayed connected despite the turbulence. All of a sudden, the boom of the tanker moved below the nose of the F-18. The hose got tangled, and the pilot of the F-18 pulled back power. After backing away from the tanker, they found out that the basket of the tanker was still attached to their refueling probe. Making matters worse, fuel was gushing out from the now broken hose, and much of it was being ingested by the right engine of the F-18. Instantly, they got an engine caution warning and a perf 90 warning on the right engine. The fuel ingestion had damaged the engine. The perf 90 warning meant that the right engine would only produce 90% of its usual thrust. Victory 206 wingmen performed a visual inspection of the plane as they took stock of their situation. They now had 15,500 pounds of fuel, and since the perf 90 warning was a land as soon as practical emergency, they decided to return to the carrier. They calculated that with this much fuel, they'd be able to make 6 approaches to the carrier, or make 4 approaches to the carrier, and then divert if needed. At this point, this made sense. The right engine did not have an afterburner anymore. If they had serious issues, then they could divert to Kandahar in Afghanistan. Moreover, they did not have maintenance technicians at Kandahar, so if they did land there, people would have to be flown out to Kandahar to fix the plane. So returning to the carrier made sense. So with that decision taken, Victory 206 and her wingman Bearcat 22 headed back for the carrier. They told air traffic controllers about their state. The drogue basket was still attached to their in-flight refueling probe. By the time this information reached the carrier, the fact that the refueling basket was stuck to the in-flight refueling probe was not mentioned. On the carrier, they started to calculate whether Flight 206 could make it back to the carrier. They had calculated that if Flight 206 could not reach the carrier with at least 4,700 pounds of fuel on board, then they'd divert the plane to Mazara Air Base in Oman. On the way back, problems started to crop up. The centerline fuel tanks were not transferring fuel. You see, the motive flow system on the F-18 were turned off when the in-flight refueling probe was extended. The fuel in the wing tanks were gravity feeding, which meant that it was flowing by the force of gravity. This was very, very slow. The rate at which this happened was about 10 pounds per minute. At this rate, in the best case scenario, it would take about 40 minutes for all of the fuel to transfer over. To maximize that flow rate, you'd have to bank the plane or put it into a side slip. After some recalculation, the decision was made to give them one attempt to land on the carrier. If they were unsuccessful, then they'd have to divert. It was at this time that Flight 206 contacted their squadron representative. They briefed him about the situation of their plane. They told him about the Perf 90 warnings, the surging right engine, and the damage to the probe. But the fact that the refueling basket was attached to the in-flight refueling probe was not mentioned. They also briefed the squadron representative about their fuel state. They currently had about 1,100 pounds of fuel in the wing tanks and 2,000 pounds of fuel in the internal tanks 2 and 3. They then came to the realization that they did not have access to all of the fuel that they had on board. The carrier strike group commander was airborne at this time, and he was listening in on to all of this. He came on and said, "I want you to send 206 to Mazura right now." His reasoning was that if they did make an approach onto the carrier, and if they could not land, then they would have just wasted a lot of precious fuel. Instead, if they diverted to Mazura right now, while they were still high up, they could get there without burning a ton of fuel. Mazura was the safer bet. And so, 10 nautical miles from the carrier, Flight 206 climbed up to 42,000 feet for the flight to Mazura. The pilots inquired if they could land at Muscat. Diplomacy prevented that, so they were initially denied permission, but as their fuel state got worse, they got permission to divert to Muscat. After jettisoning their ordnance, they made their way to Muscat. But on their way there, a dust storm at Muscat had taken the visibility below the minimum needed for a safe landing, and so they made a 50-degree turn to head for Mazura once again. At 1:01 p.m. local time, things got even worse for Flight 206. The right engine had flamed out. They jettisoned the centerline tank, and the squadron leader began walking them through the procedure to restart an engine. Aboard the Eisenhower, this development threw a spanner in the works. Up until this point, they had been assuming that Flight 206 would have both of its engines. But with one engine, Mazura was no longer an option. They could make it to Muscat, but the weather was really bad there, so the decision was taken to return to the Eisenhower. They were 40 nautical miles from the carrier, and they were at 39,000 feet. Even so, they'd be cutting it close fuel-wise. With that, Flight 206 turned back. The pilot banged the plane slightly in an attempt to get the plane to transfer fuel more quickly from the wing tanks. On their way back, they tried to restart the engine, but no luck. They only had 900 pounds of fuel left. Each wing tank held about 1,000 pounds of fuel each. If only they had access to it. The pilots tried to use the APU, or the auxiliary power unit, to restart the engine, but again, no luck. At 1:08 p.m. local time, the squadron representative walked them through the landing. They had to use emergency methods to lower their landing gear, as the hydraulic pressure for the landing gear was provided by the right engine. The hydraulic pressure for the emergency extension of the landing gear was provided by the APU accumulator. This too did not work. With them running out of options, they attempted another cross-bleed start of the right engine. The left engine was ramped up to full military power, but the right engine was still unresponsive. They now had 700 pounds of fuel remaining. After a bit more troubleshooting, they got the nose gear to drop, but not the main gears. To do that, they were asked to accelerate to 350 knots. The airflow would spin up the right engine, and this should pressurize the hydraulic system to allow them to lower the landing gear. It works. Now they're ready to land. They were 4 nautical miles from the carrier. As Flight 206 made its final turn towards the carrier, the left engine flamed out. The pilot felt the jet roll slightly to the right. He responded with the left lateral stick and then full left rudder, which momentarily stopped the roll. The aircraft then made an uncommanded pitch over to about 30 to 40 degrees, nose low, and rolled right. 1.5 miles from the carrier and below 1,000 feet in altitude, in a steep bank, the pilot pulled the ejection handle. On the deck of the Eisenhower, 2 good shoots were seen, and the pilots were safely rescued. In monetary terms, the Navy was out of $59,732,379.93. The jet itself cost $41,250,457. I'm just mentioning that because that number is so specific. You'd think a multi-million-dollar fighter jet would cost a nice round figure, but no, this one cost $41,250,457. As for the reason for the crash, let me quote the report. Inadequate crew resource management at nearly every level of the chain of command contributed to the outcome of this mishap. End quote. First, the crew did not assess the severity of the damage that they had sustained. They did not consider the possibility that the right engine may have sustained some serious damage from ingesting all that fuel. They diagnosed their emergency as a land as soon as practical emergency. The Perf 90 warning was designated as such, but in the end, it was up to the pilot to use judgment to make the right call. The fact that the refueling basket was stuck to the probe was not communicated correctly. The initial decision to return to the carrier was made under the assumption that fuel from all of the tanks was available for the flight back, but due to the extended probe, this was not the case. The failures in communication also played a part. If you'll recall, they did mention that the refueling basket was stuck to their probe, but that information got lost as it went through the system. If it hadn't been, maybe someone would have said, hey, if that probe's out, they're not going to have access to all of the fuel. Maybe they should land as soon as possible. When the pilot attempted a restart of the right engine with the APU, this was not communicated well. The restart attempt would lead to a lower hydraulic pressure in the hydraulic system. That pressure was needed for an emergency deployment of the landing gear. This is why that emergency deployment of the gear failed. If this had been communicated well, someone might have gone, you might not want to do that because you're going to need that pressure for later. The moral of this story is making the right decision in the circumstances that you're in. Quote, in light of the fact that it is impossible to cover every possible contingency that may arise, cognizant commanders need to arm aircrew with the tools to make sound decisions in the cockpit. As a community, we must remain vigilant against a mindset in which a divert is viewed upon as a sign of weakness or inferior airmanship. End quote. Now, the F-18 is not a plane that I know like the back of my hand. So to help us make sense of all of this, please welcome, all the way from the Fighter Pilot Podcast, Vincent Jell-O Aiello. Hello, Jell-O. Welcome to the show. Can you just talk a little bit about yourself so that my viewers can get a feel for who you are and what it is that you do?
Absolutely, Edwin. Thanks for having me on your show. My name is Vincent Aiello. I'm a retired United States Navy fighter pilot. Spent about 25 years as an F-16 and F-18 pilot. And when I retired in 2017, I became an airline pilot as well as I started the Fighter Pilot Podcast. And it is the internet radio show that explores the fascinating world of air combat. So we talk about aircraft, weapon systems, people, stories, all kinds of fun stuff.
Yeah, it's an amazing podcast. I'm on the episode right now about the SA-3 Viking, and it is quite impressive. I love your podcast. I've been listening to it a lot, like an unhealthy amount of it.
Well, I don't know if I should say thank you or I'm sorry.
Thank you. Just fine, just fine. So, getting to the questions, can you just, walk us through the nuances and the skills of mid-air refueling? Like, if you learn to tank with one plane, can you like transfer those skills over to another tanker? Like, let's say you learn to tank with a KC-135, and then can you use those skills on a KC-1, on a KC-10, or do you have to like relearn everything from scratch?
No, the procedures are transferable. It's very similar. The difference is for those particular two aircraft that you mentioned is that the KC-135 has the boom that's adapted with a rather short hose with the drogue that we engage for Navy aircraft.
Hmm.
And sometimes the KC-135 on its wingtips, more so recently than when I was a younger pilot, will have the pods that are like the KC-10, which is a much longer hose with a basket. And so the bottom line is you stabilize behind the basket, and then if there's any movement, you try to either get in sync with it or just time it so that as you advance the throttles to have a little bit of closure, you engage it firmly but smoothly and not too fast. And then you have to stay in the right position. So I always said
Hmm.
that the KC 135 was easier to engage, but more difficult to stay in. And the
Hmm.
KC 10 was just the opposite.
Okay, what about how do you like deal with the wake turbulence and stuff like that? Because these are massive, massive planes, and like the F-18 is like kind of tiny by comparison.
That is true. The wake turbulence is generally a bigger threat farther behind the aircraft that you're following and more because of the wing tips and the wingtip vortices that come off. When you're right next to the aircraft, especially right behind it in the case of the KC-10, or maybe on those wingtip pods on the KC-135, for whatever reason, it's not that big a deal.
Oh, okay. So my next question is, can you differentiate between land as soon as possible emergencies and land as soon as practical emergencies? Because as a layperson, to me, it just seems like, different ways of saying the same thing.
Well, and it's not because, so imagine, Arun, we were in a room together
Mhm.
and I threw something at you, right?
Okay.
So you turn around and here's something flying at your face. Well, instinctively, you're going to either duck or try to block it out of the way, aren't you? So
Mhm.
that to me is kind of a land as soon as possible. In other words, if you don't do something, something bad is going to happen. And if you don't duck or move or block what I throw at you, it's going to hit you in the face and you're not going to be happy.
Mhm.
On the other hand, suppose I bring with me a snake or I don't know, something else dangerous, and I put it on the ground in front of you as you're maybe walking towards me. Well, you can stop, you can back up, you can walk around. And so you have a little bit more time with that particular threat. And so a land as soon as practical emergency is more like that, in so much as you have a little bit of time. It's still a threat, but you have a little bit more time to deal with it.
Okay, that is a great analogy. That's a great way of explaining it. Yeah, now it's clear. On this flight, they had a perf 90 warning. Can you go over what that is? Is that something that you see all the time, or is that like super rare?
I would say it's fairly rare. It tells you that your FADEC, which, if I remember correctly, is fuel and air. Oh boy, I shouldn't even gone there, but it's the computer that monitors the engine on the F-18 Super Hornet. And so I flew that probably, I never actually checked my hours, but several hundred, maybe 500 hours compared to over 3,000 in the Legacy Hornet. So it's not something the regular Hornet has, but the Super Hornet has the FADEC, and it's a computerized engine control. And usually everything is just normal. But once in a while, if something happens, then it has different uh, indications that can tell you that something's not right. So it might tell you can't have afterburner, or that you're stuck at idle, or it's going to just shut down. And Perf 90 was one of those, as I recall, where, okay, something's not right, but I still have roughly 90% of my performance. So I should be fine. But I think to your point, Arun, based on this particular context, when the caution, and I shouldn't call it a caution, but when that indication comes up, I think is important because it happened right as we had the problem with the probe and the drogue. And so clearly there's something else going on. In other words, right away we have what, fuel going down the intake, and we see this warning or this indication. And so clearly it's not just you're flying along and something's happening on its own. It's because of something that just happened.
Okay, yeah, so it's kind of like a compounding issue where, something happens and then that's gonna like uh, have a detriment effect on the airplane later on. So it's like a compounding failure. The small issue can cause a lot more failures down the road. Is that what you're saying?
I guess what I'm saying, I think that's true, but that actually was not what I was trying to say. I didn't do a very good job of articulating it. In other words, if I'm flying along in a Super Hornet and all of a sudden I get a performance 90 as I'm just doing nothing, then I think, is that a false indication? And I'm not going to treat it like a false indication, but I'm going to be a little more curious about why it happened. On
Mhm.
the other hand, if I'm trying to aerial refuel and I rip the drogue off and a bunch of fuel goes down my engine and all over the canopy, and all of a sudden I get a performance perf 90 indication, then I have a pretty good idea of why.
Okay, so it's all about the context.
Right.
So, is there a tendency for new pilots to view diverting as a sign of weakness? I'm just wondering that because the report calls that out specifically. Is that really a tendency there?
I don't think it's such an issue for new pilots. I would say it's a bit more complicated than that. Now, if so, when I was a brand new pilot, I had trouble landing aboard a carrier one particular night. And it wasn't that it was real varsity conditions or anything else. I just had a night in the barrel, as it's called. And frankly, most young pilots have it. And I ended up diverting
Mhm.
home that night. And as it turned out, I actually got to sleep in my own bed because we're off the coast of Florida where I lived. And so it wasn't the end of the world. I flew out the next day and had some counseling, and I did fine in the end. So I think the reason for diverting maybe could have some negative context. And in my case, I chalked it up to being a young pilot. And it's one of those rites of passage that many young pilots go through, not all. But I think to the deeper level here, for the Air Wing commander who's quoted in the report and who was involved, they don't want to have to answer to their bosses of why is there an aircraft diverted. So the initial reaction is always going to be to bring your chicks home, right? You're always going to want everything where you can have your maintenance right there on the aircraft carrier hangar instead of hundreds of miles away where it's going to be a large logistics effort. Not to mention now you have two crew that are stranded in Kandahar or wherever. So it, I don't think of it as being a negative type of situation. I think it more of it just makes sense to try to bring an aircraft home if you can.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So when it comes to carrier ops, like, sometimes you might be in the middle of the ocean. So is there ever a situation where you do not have an alternate airport to divert to, like your carrier is the only option? Does that ever happen?
Quite frequently, it's called blue water ops as compared to divert ops. And divert ops or operations simply means I have an airfield I know I can go. And in fact, they've even been warned that I might go there. Now, blue water ops is where you are, as the name implies, out in the middle of the ocean. So there's almost nothing you can do to get where you need to go. And I think it's worth pointing out here, Arun, that there was once a situation with an aircraft carrier that a couple of aircraft were airborne and they had big problems. And they actually decided it was not safe to bring them aboard. And so they launched a bunch of tankers, I forget how many, and they ended up escorting this aircraft all the way, I want to say to Midway Island or somewhere. It was like maybe 1,000 miles away. And so when you're blue water ops, you still have some options if you get creative. And similarly, when you're divert ops, sometimes the weather can get bad suddenly, or the airfield can close or change their mind about having you. So you always have to be flexible and adaptable to the situation.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that, the airport can like change their mind about having you. Diplomacy plays a really big part in that. How quickly can things like that change?
Well, generally, we won't count an airfield as a divert unless we know that we're going to be welcome there. Now,
Mhm.
the problem is in certain parts of the world, there are a lot of tensions in the area, and there could be possibly repercussions if a smaller country, particularly, said, "Oh, sure, we'll let you land here, Americans," and others in the region say, "Oh, really? Well, then you're not going to get this favor from us, or we're going to
Oh.
start doing this to you." So, yes, there are a lot of ramifications of supporting Americans in that regard, or
Mhm.
probably any foreign military, I suppose. So yes, that is an issue.
And who makes like all of these divert calls? Like, is it the pilots or does someone higher up in the chain of command make all of these divert calls?
Generally, a Navy pilot who's airborne should never divert without checking with the ship first. Now, if you're on fire and it's a land as soon as possible and there's an airfield below you, I mean, look, remember the EP-3 that collided with the fighter some years ago and had to land in Hainan, China? They just there was no choice. That's what they needed to do, is either that or probably crash and kill everybody aboard. So if there is time, generally speaking, you want the folks in charge to make the decision to divert, because it does have ramifications on the fleet as well as the your allied countries or whoever, wherever you're going. Can we get rescue forces in there? But also, what is the ship doing the next day? If the ship's going to pull into port and have a few days off, then it's very difficult to get people off to go fix the broken airplane. I had a personal experience with that when an aircraft landed once in Iraq in 2003, and the ship pulled into a local port visit the next day. And so getting the permissions from the country where it was pierside to fly folks off with their necessary tools was a big deal. So there's a lot that goes into that decision.
Yeah, I just realized that you cannot launch aircrafts like when you're in port. I just figured that out for some reason.
Well, you theoretically can certain aircraft. The S3 used to be able to do it with no wind. And of course, you can launch helicopters. But for the most part, yes, you do need to be moving.
Researching this, I took a quite a deep look at the F-18's fuel system, and it uses something called the motive fuel flow system. It has no moving parts, and apparently it's highly reliable. Have you ever heard of it failing?
Not that I recall specifically. Now, we would often train to the possibility of fuel being trapped, maybe because if a maintenance worker leaves, let's say, a tool or a rag in the fuel tank, which is not completely unheard of, that it could block and cause the motive pump to fail in that case. But even just trying to remember which pumps used what sorry, I should say which tanks use what types of pumps, because there was many different kinds, including just good old fashioned flow due to gravity, that became difficult to remember some of the nuances. And now, a few years removed, I couldn't necessarily speak to all the idiosyncrasies of them. But yeah, it is a brilliant system, as I understand. It kind of uses Venturi effect.
Yeah, I was curious about that because it uses like a high pressure liquid, in this case fuel, to pump more fuel. So what if you're inverted? Does that like change the pump characteristics at all?
Well, we have a 10-second inverted limit for partly that reason, as well as oil and other reasons. So it is a concern, but generally you don't spend, unless you're a Blue Angel, too much time inverted.
Okay.
Well, and I should say, to be clear, inverted with negative G. If you're performing a loop, anyone who's ridden a roller coaster, you're upside down, but you're still being pushed into your seat, and that's just a
Mhm.
sensation of the physical effects on your body.
Okay, how does air traffic control work on an aircraft carrier? Because in this case, like quite a bit of information, important information was not disseminated correctly, and that caused a little bit of problems. Like, how does air traffic control work on an aircraft carrier?
Sure. Well, we'll start from the inside and work our way out. So
Mhm.
on the flight deck, you have the air boss and the mini boss, which are two aviators who are up in the tower that can observe what's going on. And they own everything on the flight deck and then within a couple miles of the ship and a couple thousand feet above. So anything you can basically see visually. So the takeoffs and landings, the helicopters that are nearby, et cetera. And then on the way out, you have a control agency called departure, just like leaving a major airport. And on the way in, you have a approach. And so those two agencies that use radar on the outside of the ship, but the folks are down inside the ship looking at scopes, they will control the safe and expeditious launch and recovery of aircraft. Then you have what's called strike, and you have Red Crown, and you have all these other agencies that are performing different functions. And then eventually you might end up with E2 or AWACS control if the Air Force is nearby with their E3. And so generally you're under the control of someone at pretty much all times, including the mission in question for today's discussion.
Okay. So when it comes to landing, is there a carrier version of ILS, or is it just visual all the way in?
No, there is. It's called ICLS. And interestingly, the FA-18, at least in the Navy and Marine Corps here in the United States, does not have regular ILS. They only have ICLS. And it functions for the carrier just like ILS does for other aircraft at the field.
So I guess it'll like account for the movement of the flight deck because the ship is going straight, or so does that like account for all of that?
There are some stabilization measures built into it, as I understand. It tries to bring you to a point where intended landing should happen regardless of what the ship is doing, but it's going to only be so good. If the ship is heaving quite a bit, it might not be terribly accurate. But on the other hand, you don't want to fly down the glide slope and go up and down every time the ship is going up and down. You generally want to stay in the middle, and then
Mm.
once you get close to landing, that's where the landing signal officers can give you the last minute inputs for the deck is down but you're on glide slope, or the deck is up and you're a little low, or something along those lines. So that's why pilots on their collateral duty days will stand out on the flight deck and assist the landings.
Okay. So now I just want to like, talk to you a little bit about the F-18 itself because it sounds like a really amazing plane. So back in the World War II days, Japan had this whole design philosophy of we're not going to get hit, so we're not going to have a lot of armor. Whereas the Americans, they really had a lot of armor on their planes. What's the design philosophy for the F-18 and the jets of today? Because they look lethal, but at least from where I sit, they look a little bit fragile. Is that the case?
I would say that's a fairly safe way to describe it, although I think it's overly simplified, and I don't mean that to be insulting, everyone.
That's fine.
Every aircraft is a trade-off, right? Just like so many other things in life. And so there are compromises that need to be made. Now, you take an aircraft like the A-1 Sky Raider from Vietnam, or the A-10 Thunderbolt II of current operational employment, and they both have armor, as you put it.
Mhm.
They have protection for the pilot, and it's because of the mission. They are down very close to ground threats. And in fact, there are documented cases of that armor protecting those pilots, and that's a good thing. Any fighter is going to be quite a bit removed, generally speaking. And weight is such a factor that it's a calculated risk to say, well, we're not going to put big armor on the nose of an F 15, let's say, because if the aircraft is hit by bullets from another aircraft or a missile from another aircraft, well, then that's a concern. But they'll have time, hopefully, if they're alive, to eject. Whereas if an A-10 is struck, but the pilot is fine, but he's close to the ground, he might not have enough time to eject. And so it's a trade-off. And the F-18 has no additional armor that I'm aware of that I've ever learned in over 3,000 hours of flying it to protect the pilot. It's just part of the regular structure of the aircraft.
Okay. And the funny thing about the F-18 is that I've seen a lot of countries that don't have navies order the plane. I think like Switzerland comes to mind, Finland maybe, Australia. These they use it in their air force. Why do you think that is? It's a navy fighter. So wouldn't they be like better suited with like an actual thoroughbred air force fighter?
Yeah, I mean, from the point of view of you don't need the super strong landing gear and some of the other modifications that a naval based aircraft needs, yes, I would agree with that. But just like trade offs on the aircraft design, I believe countries have to make trade offs and compromises. And while I would love to say that I think the process is pure, I believe there's also an element of pressure or politics perhaps that goes into this. So maybe some of the manufacturers say, well, you bought this other aircraft from us before. So if you buy this new aircraft, we'll continue to give you support on the other one at a better deal.
Oh,
Or
okay.
hey, if we'll sweeten it if you do this, and we'll sell you also that. And so I don't know that process real well, Arun. It's not something I have experience in, but just from what I observe, it seems like on the news and social media, I have a hard time believing it's purely just what's the best aircraft for us. And so it's possible that there's other things happening that make the F-18 a good buy. Now, but that being said, it is a great airplane. I mean, right, for Switzerland, the landing gear is far too strong, but maybe that's a trade-off for them because they love the slow speed maneuvering, or they love the two engines, or they know that they have pilots who have been to the States on exchange tours and that was the aircraft that they flew. So I don't know the exact reason why these countries choose the aircraft that they do, but clearly they fly them and employ them well.
A lot of the time I've seen like on YouTube especially, American planes landing on foreign carriers, the Charles de Gaulle comes to mind, and foreign carriers, I mean planes landing on American carriers. What kind of safety prep goes into that? You have to like, I assume you'll have to like recalibrate the trap system, the wires and the catapults. So what goes into that?
Well, first off, they have to make sure the aircraft are compatible before they'll even attempt it. So I assume that folks that are smart in the naval systems engineering for the catapults and arresting gear and the flight decks and the fuel and all the various systems have compared notes. And that's also why, by the way, there are various aviation standards like NATO standards for fuel and hydraulic fluids and different things, so that if you land an F-18 on the Charles de Gaulle or a Rafale on the Nimitz, that you know you can still get a little service and you're not going to be stuck there. But as far as the arresting gear motors and catapults, as long as there's compatibility, they just need to make sure the settings are set correctly so that it doesn't accidentally over fire on the catapult or under pull on the arresting gear. And so you can imagine the degree of coordination that goes in well before aircraft land on each other's carriers. They make sure all of that is solved and they mitigate the risk as much as possible.
Mhm. And what do you think is next for the F-18? The F-18's been with us for quite a while. Do you think it'll be upgraded like the Hawkeye? Like, or do you think, something new is going to come in and replace it entirely?
Well, when you say F-18, let's not forget you have the A through D, and
Mhm.
even in that set of Hornets, as we call them, the A and B have been gone for a while, but the C and D are mostly gone. Our demonstration squadron just transitioned. The last few Marines are getting out of them, and so the U.S. Navy is and Marine Corps are mostly done with the Hornet. But you also have the Super Hornet, and that's the E and F models, and those are new and are expected to fly for several decades, and there will be incremental advancements like the Block 3 that just came out for the Super Hornet. And so I expect it will fly for the foreseeable future.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for doing this. Hope you have a
You're
great day
welcome.
ahead. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. I hope you liked the episode as much as I liked making it. A big thank you to Jell-O for taking the time out of his day to share his experience and knowledge with us. Thank you to the US Navy for having such amazing footage. I'll catch you guys next time.